Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. I'm David Sarnoff, the Director of Strategic Partnerships for Loeb Leadership. Today, I will go by my nickname, DB, so as not to cause confusion with my colleague and panelist, David Robert. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just want to mention that Loeb Leadership is a certified woman-owned business founded by our CEO, Natalie Loeb. We are a management and leadership training and development company that develops extraordinary leaders and inclusive cultures. We want this to be participatory with the audience. Please feel free to utilize the chat. I think you have the option of identifying yourself or remaining anonymous, but please, we welcome comments and questions. So to start off our conversation today, I'd just like to get into it. For the past several years, there has certainly been a renewed effort to increase people's awareness about the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as to embed DE&I in an organizational culture. Some law firms have done better than others over the years, and many are evaluating their efforts as to whether their commitment to DE&I is authentic, meaning it's a true commitment to the people who work at the firm, or alternatively, whether or not it's a performative commitment, meaning it's being done in name only to create the appearance of a meaningful commitment. We're here today to discuss external versus internal DE&I marketing and the challenges of aligning the two, among other topics. So I'd like to start off by pitching a question to our guest panelists, who we're very excited to have join us today. Deborah Ferrone, the founder of Ferrone Advisors. Deborah's an expert in legal marketing and the author of a seminal book, Best Practices in Law Firm Business Development and Marketing. Welcome, Deborah.
Hi, David. Great to be here.
Well, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. So to start off, Deborah, do you see law firms using DE&I language more frequently in their external marketing activities? And if you do, why do you think that is?
I definitely do. I think if you look at any law firm's website, or you look at their LinkedIn profile or Twitter or Instagram account, you'll see lots of DE&I language. And while I would really like to believe that firms are doing this for the good of society and because they care, and I do think a small percentage of them are doing it for the right reasons, I think a large percentage are doing it just because they're marketing savvy and they are realizing that this is something that's being demanded by two very important groups. It's demanded by recruits who are very interested in what a firm's stance is and what a firm is doing about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're also very concerned with what their clients are thinking. And I think we've seen innovation change in law firms, and it's generally based on getting kicked off, and the catalyst has been clients. So I think we're seeing clients build up more marketing pressure because they have shareholder activists and they have institutional stockholders that are telling them, you know, you have to worry about these things. You have to report on them. We want more clarity. And so they are also asking that those vendors of those firms are doing the same thing. So it's being pushed from a number of different places, I think in a number of different ways.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Deborah. Would anybody like to respond or react to this question and Deborah's response? Yeah, and so Deborah, if I could just follow up for a little bit, like what does it look like when the client raises this issue with the firm? You know, are you familiar with the messaging, the communication, how firms typically react to it?
Well, it used to be that we would just see these questions in RFPs, in requests for proposals. So if you were doing a pitch to a large company, especially a large company, there would be a question in there, just maybe one or two questions about what is the diverse makeup of your firm and what are your diversity programs or initiatives. But it's getting to be much more fulsome in the area of questioning. RFPs are much more sophisticated because there are legal operations pros right now within companies. There are procurement directors within companies. So those questions are definitely more of a driver for firms to be able to respond. But what we're also starting to see, and I've seen this with two large corporations, one in the insurance industry and another, a very large tech company that I'm sure half the firms on this call do work for, they're now doing interim questionnaires where they're saying, okay, we've done the RFP, we've met your team and they were diverse, but let's see who's really working on the matter. And let's see what kinds of work they're doing. And so they're driving this more and more and more. And I think, we're seeing the tech companies like Intapp allow for there to be systems so that firms can really track that information and then report back to their clients. But I think clients are changing the way they're asking the questions. They're not just asking it on an RFP. They're really caring. They want to know what's going on, and they will check in between at different points in the assignments.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And I want to just pivot to David Robert, our organizational culture expert. And my question to you, David, does it really matter what's driving a firm's commitment to DE&I so long as the commitment's there and people see it?
Yeah, I believe it does matter. One of the first things we do when we're working with clients on whether it's diversity, equity, inclusion, or some culture transformation is we measure the alignment across senior leaders, right? So, and we ask them a simple question: why are you making this investment in culture or in DE&I? And what we often find is that there's wide variation in senior leaders' understanding of why the firm is making those commitments. And so imagine the impact on commitment, right? So if you have a senior leader who thinks we're only doing this as an exercise of checking the box, right? Because our clients need this information for RFPs, or we're getting some pressure from other groups, that person will have a very, very different attitude towards change than somebody who thinks that we're doing this because we have a moral obligation to create this kind of an environment for our people. Because when you get deeper into DE&I culture work, there are going to be changes that have to occur, right? Things have to be tweaked, right? It's a very natural sort of output of change management. And if you are sort of not fully bought into the reason why, and you're not sort of emotionally connected to the reason why you're making these investments, then you are unlikely to make those changes. And that just creates a whole other set of challenges for trying to kind of get to that aspirational future. So definitely, I think the reasons why you're making the investment does matter.
Yeah, and I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, David, what role does leadership play in this? Because I would imagine you really do need senior leadership's not only buy-in, but enthusiasm about making change, don't you? Or am I incorrect?
Yeah, again, culture change in DE&I, it's unique because every organization kind of approaches it a little bit differently, right? As they should, because each organization kind of has its own sort of ecosystem. But one of the things that we get concerned about is when we hear messaging from a client that, oh, well, our DE&I committee is going to handle this. We're not pulling in the managing partner, or we're not pulling in our executive committee. We're going to kind of handle this ourselves. It's like, okay, you can make some change and some progress. I don't think DE&I committees are pointless. They play a valuable role in kind of moving this work forward. But if you don't have the buy-in and the advocacy from the managing partner or your CEO and your executive committee, then it's going to be much more challenging for you to make real sustainable progress. And oftentimes, again, I try not to be cynical, but if a client's trying to make an investment in culture or in substantive DE&I initiatives, and they don't have the buy-in from those at the very top of the organization who have autonomy of making decisions, then our advice is to maybe not do it at all, right? So because you're really making a promise. Culture work and DE&I initiatives are a promise to your people, and if you're not able to fulfill that promise, then you actually end up breaking trust in the long term.
If I can just build on what David is sharing, I think also, and this is particularly important in a firm space, is that you often recognize where an organization's priorities are by where they put their time and their money, right? And so understanding that it is an investment and it can't merely be relegated to just this is the sole owner and driver, and it's not actively embedded in the broader DNA of the organization. And that truly does start from the top. and the tone that they set, and how this is not a nice to have, it's a business imperative. And it has to be part of our ways of working, because it does impact how we show up with our clients. And that's also a business case, right? We're working with more and more diverse clients across the country and around the world, and they're looking to collaborate with organizations that either reflect them or understand their lived experience. And so having that deeply embedded in the ways of working and the culture of the firm is critically important as well.
Thanks, Taurus. And I'll just add that I think it goes one step further, because we've been involved in engagements where a DE&I committee or partners involved with the DE&I committee are taking on these initiatives. And while they may get support from the executive committee and the managing partner, they don't want to take a frontline position and be a spokesperson for the effort and initiative. And I think that, to David's point, does more harm than good if they're not going to be vocal supporters, because some people interpret that differently when they're not vocal than when they are. And
I mean, and I don't suggest that a managing partner or an executive committee have to do all the hard work, right? You know, even if, I mean, it's extremely helpful, even if they play the role of champion, right? So when they are talking to the firm,
I'm trying to
when they're talking to the firm, they're actually
get my tech to work. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, Joy, it's just a little choppy. All right, we lost Joy. Hopefully we'll get her right back.
Yeah.
So while we're waiting for Joy, I want to throw out this question to the panel, because it's starting to show up quite prominently in the press, and firms are taking reflective exercises to decide whether or not to engage in public debate on political or current event issues. So it's been reported widely that some legislators in Texas have issued a warning to an AmLaw 100 firm about their vocal support in assisting employees who may want to get reproductive health care in other states. And they were told that they need to retain documents, that they're potentially going to face civil litigation and potential criminal charges for assisting employees of the firm who reside in Texas. I've spoken to several firm administrators from different cities, and they fall out all over the spectrum, but I was surprised that there was more vocal support for law firms to not take a public position, because it might upset some clients who reside in these states. How does the panel feel? Joy, I asked the question about law firms getting involved in current events and political decisions, such as the overturning of Roe and providing services for their employees. Where do you come out on whether or not law firms should make public statements or take active positions to supporting their employees?
I think if you think about it, and I knew that they would do an overhead statement as soon as I started speaking, but great.
I'm sorry, Joy, we don't hear. Okay.
Can you hear me now?
We can, Joy. Go ahead.
I'm going to keep my camera off because I think that works a little bit better. So I'll just be the faceless voice. So I think that there is a difference between taking political action and being understanding of how other political happenings have affected the people that work for you. So, you know, having an open forum to discuss, like the overturning of Roe v. Wade, offering medical benefits, the same way you would offer benefits for mental health, the same way you offer benefits for in vitro fertilization, just to give something very close or parallel, the same way you offer medical benefits for knee replacement surgery or augmentation surgery, whatever it is. If it is a medical procedure between, you know, that is private to a particular person, if the company is going to support it, they're going to support it. There doesn't have to be a massive front page news article about it, but you can let your people know we're going to support you in this way. It doesn't have to be, I don't think personally, a big fanfare. But that being said, the idea of we're not going to say anything or take a stance on it, specifically because we're trying to not raise the ire of some of our clients. That's only some of your clients. What are the rest of your clients looking for? And are you looking at the majority of the people that you're going to continue to do business with going forward? Because what I've seen is that a lot more, and like a percentage difference more of the clientele of the future is looking for socially responsible law firms, medical teams, corporations, et cetera, like across the board. Even elementary schools, we've seen that in news recently as well. They're looking for people who are going to support the values beyond just a statement on the internet or a banner in a particular month, et cetera, et cetera. What are you doing from a systemic standpoint? And they want to know that. So I think when you say, or when any company says we are going to do something or not do something based on whether or not it will upset our clients, you got to figure out, is this really your client base? And is that going to continue to be your client base? Will your revenue continue to come from there in 2025, 2035, 2050, so on and so forth?
Thanks so much, Joy. Deborah, any reaction to what Joy said, or something you'd like to add to the conversation?
Well, I guess two thoughts. One is, it seems like law firms and like many corporations are kind of changing in the way we look at them from a marketing standpoint, and they're becoming more of a personality. When you see certain firms, you think about these attributes that define them. And I think these decisions are going to be accumulative. And so we're going to think of firms as either standing up for human rights and treating people well and fighting for that, or firms who don't make statements. And so I think that's a change to watch, I just think, on a macro level. But one of the things that I used to do whenever we were faced with a decision like this, a policy kind of decision at my old firms, is draw kind of concentric circles and think, who does this affect and how? And so initially, you want to do the right thing. And you think about how this affects your employees, how this affects your clients, how this affects the outside world, how it affects your vendors, your alums. And so you really need to think these things out in advance of coming out with kind of a public policy. I do think it's the right thing for firms personally to make statements about things that they strongly believe in. I think we've seen that a lot during the past year. The abortion issue, and we should call it what it is so divisive, and it's so tough. I don't know if firms are going to be comfortable coming out and making statements, but I do hope that those firms that were served that incredible letter will fight this. And I think it's interesting, the one letter we've heard about has gone to Sidley. And if you talk about a great litigation firm, you couldn't have chosen a better one. There may be one or two that are my clients that I'd have put in there, but it'll be interesting to see how Sidley approaches this. And I think we're all going to be watching. So, I wish them luck personally.
Thank you. And David?
Yeah. I don't know how you not make a statement. Especially if you're an organization that has made a public or an internal commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you have to back that up, right? So there's the language or the messaging, but there's also the action you're taking. Those things have to be aligned and done in coordination. So I think if you as a firm leader have told your people that you're authentically committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, then I don't see how you could not make a public statement about where you stand on the issue. And I think if we think about social change and political change, a lot of that is driven by corporate statements and corporate efforts. I look back to when, at the time, Governor Pence in Indiana was trying to pass outrageously homophobic legislation, and it only backfired because of corporations standing up publicly and saying, no, it's not going to happen. And the pressure that corporations mounted on the state government just sort of like was able to kind of move that legislation in a different direction, right? So, but I know there's risks involved, and we saw what happened with Disney, right? Disney made a public stance. I mean, I think they made a mistake by waiting too long, and so I think there was some disruption internally in terms of wait, you're telling us that we're an inclusive, progressive company, and yet you're not saying a word about this legislation in Florida. And then when they finally did make a statement, the governor punished them, right, by taking away their autonomous status. So there are real risks, but I think the risks are less potentially harmful than the risk of not making a statement. And quite frankly, for organizations that remain silent, silence is a statement, right? Saying nothing actually sends a very clear message about what your priority is.
I'd like to jump in and add something real quick, just adding on to what David is saying. We've been treating companies like companies, firms, entities, et cetera, like personalities, like people for a long time. And when we think about being an ally, if a company as an individual, as a personhood, if you will, is going to be an ally, to his point, you are saying something when you don't say anything, when you let things happen and you don't speak up or stand up. Also, a big part of being an ally is knowing that there is some level of cost to speaking out, to standing up for what you believe to be right, to holding the line, if you will, for the values, the standards, the equity that you want to see. There will be some inherent cost to that, and being willing to pay it in order to see what the future that you want to see. And so if corporations, firms, practices, et cetera, are seeing themselves, as a personhood or personality, then that is part and parcel of that whole freedom to do that. If you're going to be an ally or going to support diversity, equity, and inclusion, there is some level of cost to stand up for what you say you believe. And that may be the loss of a client here or there, but ultimately, if that's what you believe in, then you have to stand behind that.
And to build on what's been shared, I mean, David hit the nail on the head, right? Messages matter. And so an open and honest message is just as compelling as complete silence. And when we're in a marketplace where firms are vying for diverse talent, seeking to retain diverse talent across all demographics, it's important that the message is very clear and that there's not a hedging around how they're approaching that, right? Because just as much as it might potentially cost the loss of one client or a partnership, it could open the door for countless others of people who believe that this is the firm that I want to align myself with because they're reflecting and acting on the values that I hold within myself, to the allyship point that Joy just shared. And so in the estimation around how you bring DEI and those principles to life, this is one of those very clear moments where there's an opportunity to show we're not just sharing this performatively because it sounds good or it looks good. We're doing it because this is who we are. These are our values, and these are the people that bring our firm forward to be able to advance the work we have to do for our clients.
Thank you, Taurus, and thanks everybody for that rich exchange. So Taurus, I want to stay with you. And just to introduce you, you're one of Loeb Leadership's senior consultants on management training, retreats, DE&I work, and there's often disparities between what a firm's public commitment to DE&I is and the reality of what the people at the firm are experiencing. And if you could just share, what that looks like and what's the impact of that and, what creates that disparity?
That's a great question, DB. We know from our work with firms across the legal space that they're constantly grappling with their public commitments and then putting that into practice and embedding it deeply within their culture. And so helping the organization and every single person, right? It can't just be somebody sitting a particular role or level, helping everyone to understand that it's not about word, but actually action is the imperative that has to drive the way that the firm moves their commitments forward. And so often over the work that Loeb has done, we're partnering with firms where they're able to articulate what their DEI strategy is and how that's advancing their strategic goals. But then when it comes to actually putting that into practice, that's where we reach that tension point. And so thinking about it from an integrative perspective where it's embedded within the ways of working across the organization rather than being an add-on or nice to have is so important. And so what does that actually mean? It means considering the culture, considering the ways of working, looking at the systems and the policies and how that's brought to life, and using that critical eye to examine DEI and all of that work is so important. Along with that, recognizing that you have to center the voice of the firm members in that is so critically important. I cannot tell you how many times, and David touched on this earlier, how many times we will partner with organizations where we're only hearing the voices of this group, whether that's the partners or those sitting on the attorney side. And if we don't consider the complexity and the whole encapsulation of the experience of the entirety of the firm, we're doing ourselves a disservice. And I think within that, it's important to recognize that depending on the organization and how they've managed their talent acquisition process, the demographics might look very different across the organization of who holds power and positional influence and who might not hold that, depending on the identities that they live in every day. And so that impacts how voices are amplified, who has decision-making power, and who's actually charged and carries the burden of moving this work forward. And so understanding that rich diversity of a firm's workforce is so important, because that's that special sauce that helps to bring that commitment to life. I think that for the final piece, and you heard this touched on in the last question, is that we recognize also that firms are businesses, right? And so they have revenue targets. They have to engage with clients in a very particular way. And so there's this important balance of recognizing, okay, what is the client perception of the organization and their comfort, and also recognizing that we can't create an environment where we're placing the client needs, the client expectations over that of the internal needs of the people who actually have to meet that and bring it to life every day. And so I think that tension is very real. There's not a question whatsoever whether or not that's there, but the firm has to identify and figure out what is going to be that line that we're going to draw, and how do we really make sure that we're towing that forward and bringing everybody in the organization along with those efforts.
And thank you for sharing that, Taurus. And I also want to say Loeb Leadership is going through this internal process itself. While we have not made a public statement yet on current event issues, we are coming together as an organization to discuss this, to get everybody's feedback and thoughts and opinions, so we can make a statement that does represent a lot of the organization. But I just want to ask, what about the people who agree with the Supreme Court decision in the organization, and with respect to having an inclusive culture, how are those voices included or heard when, let's say, a majority of the firm might disagree?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that I've learned in the work that I've done for the past few years over culture and DEI is that we have done a really poor job as leaders and individuals of understanding a diversity of thought and being able to hold multiple opinions, even if they might be divergent, right? And so creating space for people to hold differing opinions while respecting the fact that these are the values of who we are as an organization and the commitments that we're going to hold. They don't have to be at odds with each other. It is not saying that the firm is going to make somebody feel marginalized and less included because they might hold an opinion that's not aligned with what the larger collective might hold. But it is understanding that you're entitled to hold whatever opinion you might have. And as far as it pertains to the work that we do every day and how we show up and who we are as a living and breathing entity in an organization, this is where our commitments are going to sit. And we're going to do whatever it takes to ensure that should somebody want to avail themselves of those commitments, they have the access and the privilege to do so, just like you have the access and privilege to say, I would not want to avail myself of those opportunities.
Now, I would add, I agree with Taurus. I would add to that this is why it's so important to really pay attention to what's happening in the political landscape, right? So, because you might have people at the firm who actually are delighted with the Roe v. Wade decision, right? Well, that's fine. That's their perspective, and they're entitled to have that. But I think if you look at the broader implications of that ruling, it has implications on marriage equality, interracial marriage, access to contraception. These are things that if we go and tinker with those things, that can cause significant stress and pain to our fellow citizens. And so I think we have to be honest about, if we're truly committed to creating a work environment where people feel psychologically and physically safe, they have opportunities to engage and thrive, then we have to do the hard work to be politically savvy, right? And really understand what's really happening. And making a stance on, we don't like this ruling because of the broader implications of what's possible, right? I mean, it has the implication to negatively impact many people, and I'm not sure everybody gets that.
So David, staying on that theme, and you alluded to it earlier, is it opening up the possibility of creating more harm than good when there are different commitments to external stakeholders, when the internal stakeholders might be experiencing something completely different? And as Tara said, when there might be two tiers within a firm of how attorneys are treated and how business services and support staff are treated.
Yeah, and so I'll respond to that, but it does kind of map back to the previous question around why there's often a lack of alignment between what we externalize and what the lived experiences of your people within the firm, right? And I can say from my experience, when there's that disparity or that sort of lack of alignment, it kind of reminds me of like New Year's resolutions, right? We're really good as humans to kind of like articulate what we want, right, our aspiration, but we're terrible about executing, right, and making it happen. And we all seen, the gyms packed full of people on January, 1st or 2nd, and then the gym's empty by end of March, right? So, which is why it's really important that whatever you commit to internally, whatever that aspirational future is that you're trying to kind of march toward, that it has to be authentic and it has to be honest. I mean, it's a serious, I think, a worthy conversation to have, and you shouldn't rush through that. We call it the discovery conversation around what do we really want to achieve, and is it achievable, right, given the current climate within the firm and our risk tolerance? Because once you make that commitment and you articulate it, whether it's a DE&I statement or a culture commitment, you got to back it up, right? Doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It doesn't mean you're not going to make mistakes or get sidetracked, but that should be the direction that you're rowing in. And when that's not happening and you lose that sense of authenticity, then what you do is you lose credibility. And so in the future, when let's say you're required to affect some type of change for firm survival, right, or sustainability, it's going to be a much harder sell to get your people on board because they've experienced that sort of lack of commitment that you articulated the first time, right? So again, you don't have to come out of the gates with this super aspirational commitment, right? I would say start more modestly in terms of what you think you can achieve, and get some wins under your belt, and that should be an ever evolving aspirational statement that you have for the firm. But if you come out with this unrealistic statement that everyone knows is not going to be achievable, then I think over the long term you actually end up breaking trust.
Real quick, I think that one of the things that we're talking about, I'm going to play with your analogy you used, David, is accountability, right? If you're making a commitment, it then begs the question, who you're accountable to. And so if you're making a commitment that you want to go to the gym and lose 30 pounds, sure, if you're self-motivated to actually move that forward, you hopefully will get closer to that goal. Versus your accountability looks very different if you engage the trainer, who's going to make sure you actually show up on a daily basis, you're attending to your sessions, your form is correct, and you're performing appropriately, right? And so part of the questions that firms have to ask themselves is, who are we held accountable to for these commitments around diversity, equity, and inclusion? I would argue that, of course, your clients are going to be the key audience, but you cannot overlook the fact that you are accountable to your internal folks who actually ensure that you can deliver on your promise to your clients as well.
And Deborah, if I could bring you into this conversation, that to what extent when a firm is focused on marketing efforts, are they bringing in the culture and internal stakeholder perspective in what they're communicating to clients? Are they interwoven, or are they separated?
I think they're separated. I mean, to use the gym analogy, because we like this now, and I'm dealing with that gym analogy today, and finding time to go. So I think the idea of not having the proper equipment and trying to exercise just doesn't work. So I think, it's part of business development too. Very often what we uncover in doing a strategic plan isn't necessarily that the firm doesn't have good client prospects. It's just maybe they don't have a culture of sharing information between one another, and so they're missing cross marketing opportunities, or there isn't a culture of developing business. And so culture comes into play in so many different ways. And I think building the right culture for DEI or for CSR on a larger level or for marketing is just so key. And what I love that David said, you need an actionable plan. And that very much is like how we do marketing, right? You can't really put the tactics before you put the strategy. You have to have the strategy and then do the tactics. So, fine, you're going to sponsor lots of events where your clients are being nominated that deal with minority causes. I mean, that's nice. That's a tactic and that's responsive to a client, which might be a good thing to do. But what are you doing to help your people internally? And do you have a diverse board of management? And do you have a pipeline program where you're really trying to encourage people to do well? And are you coaching people who might need that additional coaching? And I think those things are so important. So I think the infrastructure issue is so key. And you need to kind of fix that and figure that part out before you go on to the next stage.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And Joy, go ahead, Joy. Go ahead. Well, Taurus, with respect to what David and Deborah said, is expressing an ambition around DE&I good enough for a firm anymore? I mean, how are they going to back it up?
I think that expressing it is a great first step, right? Like we've all articulated that in our conversation, that making that commitment is important, but a commitment without action is just empty words at the end of the day. And I think that David called it out perfectly of what are those quick wins, those steps that you can take to start to move yourself closer. It's not to say we're going to make a commitment and then we're going to go all the way to the end of the journey and assume that if we don't reach that mark from the very beginning that we've somehow failed. There are a lot of incremental steps that can be taken. Part of that is also then coming back. And after that commitment has been articulated, then communicating to every stakeholder, internal and external, what does that look like? How does it show up? How are we holding ourselves accountable? And then how are we actually measuring the success of moving ourselves forward and ensuring that there's that collective alignment. One of the key things that we talk about in many of our workshops with firms and different organizations that we partner with is this idea of direction, alignment, and commitment, right? And so it really becomes, what is that North Star that we are all working towards in service of fostering an equitable and an inclusive culture where folks do feel psychologically safe and they belong? What does it mean for every single one of us, not just one or two people, to bring that to life? Every single manager, every single partner, every single leader, individual contributor, and associate, to bring that to life in the firm. And then how are we going to actually measure that and get ourselves closer to that end goal? And you can do the research, right? You can read a Harvard Business Review or a piece in Forbes or something in Fast Company. Any piece will tell you that when you start to embed that in the culture, undoubtedly, unequivocally, there's always a positive bottom line impact on employee success, retention, satisfaction, belonging, happiness, recruitment. Every single metric across the organization and its culture increases and improves, and that thereby impacts the bottom line, which is, of course, a goal that every firm has. And so recognizing that and bringing it to life is so important. And also keeping in mind, a few weeks ago, we were working with a client and it was casually stated that the managing partner and their executive board just wasn't really bought in to the DEI work, right? And that it was landing on the shoulders of the more junior staff to drive that forward. And at the end of the day, that's kneecapping the work from the very beginning. Because if it's not coming from every single level, then we're not actually embedding it in the work that we're doing, and we can't actually move those commitments forward in a sustainable and a very real manner.
Yeah, so totally agree with that. One of the things I kept thinking about, Taurus, as you were speaking, was going back to your, the term you used around accountability, right? So, part of, when we think about culture, right? So, and people's perception of the culture of the firm they work at, when they're evaluating the culture, what they're really doing is they're actually evaluating how the work really gets done. It's not how the work gets articulated, right? It's not the programs and policies that sort of shape and guide the work. It's at the end of the day, how are we really getting the work done? And oftentimes there's a difference between what really happens compared to what's been articulated in terms of how the work should be conducted, right? And if you aren't holding yourself accountable for getting on the same page, right? And aligning your behavior and your actions around what that commitment is, then you are creating that helping to create that disparity. And that disparity is going to adversely impact how people feel about the organization, right? And especially if you have externalized something very different as well. That's why those differences exist, because really getting that clarity in terms of how the work really gets done, it's really difficult to do that, right? So it requires a level of vulnerability. It requires a level of risk-taking that just, quite frankly, a lot of law firms just don't have a strong appetite to do.
Right, and I agree. I mean, David, and you talked about this really as a business process, and it is a business process. I would almost go so far as to thinking aloud that this is very much like creating any kind of a plan, right? You're going to do your market research. You're going to figure out what the problem is. Lawyers are smart, and people who work at law firms are smart. Figure out what the issues are, look at your own numbers, see what other firms are doing, but also look at outside of your industry to see how people are approaching these issues. And then create a plan that's inclusive, that involves your leadership, whether that's the head of the firm, which is the right leadership to have, but also your practice heads to get people to buy in. I think involving the right people, creating the right tactics that you can measure, because again, in strategic planning, we always try to measure what we're doing and figure out what those key performance indicators are. And then reassessing, at the end, make sure that, I should say at the end of a cycle, that you're kind of going back and saying, okay, what did we promise to do? Who was doing it by when? Was that accomplished? What can we do to improve it next time? And I think the interesting challenge of being in a professional service firm is that you have to constantly evolve. And the firms that don't constantly evolve really do get left behind. We've seen that. And so, doing these kinds of plans, I think, is so important. Putting things in writing, not necessarily the huge binder, but having the few page plans in writing that can be articulated to one another. Those things are really, I think, a good key to survival.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Go ahead, Paris.
I was going to just say, I think that what David and Deborah are also calling out is this idea of not just change management, but systems change management, right? And the fact that systems are designed to elicit a certain outcome. And so we have to go back to the root to redesign and disrupt those systems. And much of what we're discussing, firms are not immune to, right? We all exist in this smog that we breathe in every day, that we've been socialized in, and then we bring that into our workplace. And so if we just think that we're playing whack-a-mole, trying to fix one or two issues along the way, we're not actually addressing what the root cause and challenges are and taking that step back and really assessing and understanding what are we trying to solve for, and how do we truly have to potentially change our ways of working, our ways of thinking. And that's not easy. We're not saying that that's easy and it's going to happen overnight. It's going to take time, but when done effectively and when done consistently, it really can have a transformative impact on the culture of the organization, the way that they engage with clients, and the way that associates, team members, business services, everybody understands and experiences their time in the organization.
Thanks so much. And thank you to the participant who submitted a question in the chat. I'd like to bring Joy in on this one. Are you there, Joy?
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Joy. So on this theme of disparity, I want to read the question in the chat for you and get your reaction. How to handle a firm that recognizes holidays like Juneteenth, Martin Luther King Day, Rosh Hashanah as a floating holiday, but operates business as usual, holding firm-wide events and expectations for deliverables. On the contrary, where other holidays like July 4th and Christmas, the firm is operating on a skeleton staff and broad understanding that deliverables will need an extension of time due to those holidays. So along that theme of, business service, support staff being treated differently than attorneys, where holidays are treated differently, what's your reaction to that?
I think that's a really, really good question, because what you're essentially saying is one holiday is not quite as important as another holiday, or not quite as recognized. Like there's tiers, there's classism among the holidays, if you will. And so if you're going to do floating holidays, float them all. At least that would be my opinion. If you add up, all the days that people might want to take off, Martin Luther King, President's Day, Labor Day, Arbor Day, I'm just throwing out everything you can think of, Christmas, Easter, New Year's, all of that, and it turns out to be 21 days. Give everybody 21 floating days. Use them as you will. And understand that the flow of work will need to be covered. And so at any given time, it turns into math at that point. At any given time, you need 80% of your folks there. Okay, and you staff accordingly. And now it has become absolutely equitable because people can use their days when it's important to them. And there's no expectation. If you want to work Christmas Day because you don't do Christmas, that's fine. And if someone wants to work on Memorial Day or on Flag Day, whatever it might be, that's their choice. And it is no longer an expectation that, it's Christmas Eve, everybody's going to be gone, or we don't have any expectations. Business trudges on as it always has, and there's no tiers or classes amongst the holidays. Now, that being said, if there's some agreement or everybody decides we're all going to collectively take these days off, it could be June 12th, just randomly, or we're all going to take August 1st through 5th off and shut down the firm for some personal time. They can do that too. But I think as we move forward, that is something that people haven't done before. I'm trying to outspeak the speaker over me. That's something people haven't done before. And it feels very weird, very uncomfortable, very unusual, and to some people, unnecessary. Why are we doing this for a small number of people? We're not telling you to give up the holidays you've done before. We're telling you to make other people's precious days or days they want just as important as the ones that you have. That's what equity looks like. We're not taking away anything from anybody. We're saying, let's give everybody the same chance, same amount of time, and the same respect, so that when they take a day off, there isn't this subtle eye rolling of, I guess you're not going to turn in this thing, let it all be equal. And I think that feels weird to people who haven't done it before, but I do think that's directionally right. That's just my opinion, though.
Yep, I agree with that.
Any other reactions, responses, Deborah, Taurus?
Well, it goes back to Taurus's, statement about systems change management, right? So, it may seem like a very subtle adjustment to make all the holidays floating, but it requires the firm to be willing to make that decision. Like, we're going to radically change the way in which we approach paid time off around celebrations of holidays, and make some kind of commitment to that. So I love what Joy said, because it's such a simple solution, right, to what could be a very icky, divisive issue, right? So.
And if I can just build on that, because I think Joy is spot on. Also thinking about two other factors. One, communicating the why. Often organizations will just deploy a new policy or framework or approach, and they don't take the step to actually educate and inform their team as to why they're doing this, so that there's collective visibility around that. So I think that's one precondition that's critically important. The second component to think about is that at the end of the day, yes, firm leadership, executive committee, managing partners, of course, they are setting that the North Star that a firm is working for. But the day-to-day management of team members, associates, and so on is by their leader every single day. And so also making sure that managers and leaders are equipped with the knowledge, skills, and resources to understand what does this mean for our practice, so that you're not creating divergent and disparate experiences across the organization, which then creates a whole different level of inequities within the firm as well, right? So it's important to make sure that those individuals who are responsible for managing the day-to-day experience of their team members understand, what does this mean for me, and how do I operationalize this as well?
And Deborah, go ahead, Deborah.
Oh, I don't think, at a lot of firms, I don't think they are realizing what they're doing as far as these holiday situations, and from a marketing standpoint, we don't always hear the full story. And I can remember speaking at a bar association program on diversity. I know David's involved in that program now as well. And it was fascinating. We were talking about being involved in new business pitches, and I was speaking mainly to a diverse audience and said, it's great to see that at least the marketing department is making sure that 50% of the people on these pitches are diverse. And someone raised their hand and said, yes, I'm included in on the pitches. They include my bio and my photo, and sometimes I even get to go to the meetings, but I'm often not there at the time the assignment comes in and we're doing the work. I don't get the assignment. And so we were talking about what can that person do? Here this woman is, she's a minority. She doesn't necessarily feel comfortable going to her partner who's not a minority and saying, calling them out on this because she wants to be a partner. She wants to stay employed. She doesn't want to feel insecure about things in the future. And she has, these kinds of hurdles to get over. And I completely understand it. So I think that's a case where allies are really important. And I think if we see something, we've got to say something, whether it's a person in marketing, whether it's a person in management, whether it's a person in the records department, to say, by the way, I've noticed this. And hopefully we can have a more open dialogue so that the next time that woman is not put on a matter, she will be more comfortable saying to someone, hey, wait a second, you didn't put me on. And hopefully it won't happen in the future. So it's interesting that what we want isn't always necessarily what automatically happens. We need those checks and balances, and we need our allies.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And as we're approaching the top of the hour, I'd encourage the audience to put in questions or comments. And I'd like to just throw this question to the panel to give our audience some practical takeaways and strategies. What are some of the strategies for ensuring alignment between marketing messaging and people's lived experience within the firm? How do you blend and align those things together?
Well, I think so. I can jump in, DB. So, I think the first thing you have to do is you have to really have a pulse of what's happening within the organization, right? So, we have a client right now that we're doing a DE&I assessment with them, and the results are pending. But and they also reached out and said, hey, we're revising our website, and we'd love to put some DE&I language. Can you kind of help us figure out what that should look like? And my response was, why are you doing that right now? Wait until the results of your audit come in. You have a better understanding of how people's lived experience is playing out within the firm, so that you're not making a false or inauthentic or disingenuous commitment externally, right? So I think you have to understand, collect data, really understand what's happening within the firm, and align that with the message. I'm not saying if you have huge opportunities for improvement, you're going to externalize that, but you don't want to make a commitment or send a message out publicly that is in direct contradiction to what's the lived experiences within the firm. That would be a big no-no.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to add, if I can, this one thing that I'm thinking of, like when we talk about, how firms are approaching DE&I, they have a council or a committee or a person that they've hired. It's almost as if they are trying to outsource the work that needs to be done. And there's this desire to have, to hire someone or to appoint some people and say, handle this and get it right. And we'll be back to check on you, mid-year, end of year, et cetera. And I think the way to really, quote unquote, get it right is to look within, because everyone on this panel, everyone in this country, everyone that can hear us right now, we're all part of the problem, because we've all grown up. Yes, Gen Z, you too. We've all grown up in this environment that has supported systemic discrimination in one form or another. We all have our own biases. And if we don't reconcile with that, however it looks for us, we're going to continue to struggle with this, because it's always going to feel uncomfortable to include people we haven't paid attention to before. So if we don't all internally look at what we can all do to push this forward, we're going to always be waiting on somebody else to get the ball rolling. And that's why we can't progress forward. We've got to all take our own piece of what we can do and figure out how we're part of the problem, and keep pushing everyone from the leaders to the new hires. Every single person has to be involved in this. The same way they're all involved with making money, they need to all be involved with making equity.
Joe, I'm glad you called that out as a millennial on the panel. I think that recognizing that there are generational realities that all organizations are grappling with, where you see differences between senior leadership and more junior staff, is important to call out. So I appreciate that. I also think, too, we've talked about this extensively, but in terms of the strategy, back to your point, DB, is first and foremost centering the voices of the employees. right? You have to understand your current state to understand how you're going to get towards your desired state. And it's not this idea that your desired state truly is something that's actually achievable, right? It's something that you're constantly pressing toward getting there, and you're trying to get just that much closer to that limit that might not exist, because it's a constant aspiration for every individual, to Joy's point, and every organization as a living entity. I think the second piece is really thinking about how do you tell that story, and not something that is blowing smoke, but really thinking about what is the story that we want to tell about the experience of our organization, what it's like to work here, what it's like to be served by our team, and for clients to experience that. And then how does every single person in the firm then become an ambassador of that story and help to communicate that and share that consistently? And again, it doesn't mean that everything's perfect and that you are going to have rose-colored glasses, but collectively a shared voice emerges, and that becomes a really powerful way to market and to engage and to bring to life a DEI strategy.
Yeah, and I think, going back to some tactical things that folks can consider is that especially external messaging, right? So what I would suggest is that message has two components, right? It's what's our commitment around DE&I, and then here's how we're backing that up, right? So be really specific about the programs and policies that you have implemented that are actually moving that work forward. So it's not just a sort of blanket generic commitment. You're actually demonstrating through evidence of what you're doing internally to enhance that lived experience of the people you've chosen to kind of join your team. And I see all the time where you have just part one, right? You see the commitment on the website or in the marketing messaging, but there's not a lot of evidence included to support. Here's how we're actually moving the needle on this.
And Deborah, if you can address just this, requirement of transparency that clients are requiring of their firms in questionnaires, in being able to articulate their firm demographics, and as you said before, who's actually working on these matters throughout from beginning to end. Where would you advise firms to start from that marketing perspective?
I think the role of the marketing department is interesting in this, because I think as a marketer, whether you're the CMO or you're the most junior person on the staff, you have a role to almost be like a news reporter, right? Not that you're necessarily going to be saying things to the outside world without being thoughtful, but you want to know what's going on inside the company. And so I would make sure that you are encouraging meetings with new associates who just came to the firm or lateral partners, and finding out what's important to them. What did they think of the firm's diversity program? What did they think of the firm's diversity profile? What do they think could be done? And really doing that research internally. I think that's going to be vital. And then, if allowed to, I would be meeting with clients and finding out the same kinds of things from them, because those are going to be ways of pushing change within a firm. Since firms care about hiring these days and they care about holding on to clients, I think those are two groups to really get close to. And there are some firms that are doing some great things in this area. Baker McKenzie puts out a report, a scorecard of how they're doing and how they want to do. I think it's both CSR and DEI. Paul Weiss is doing a lot in this area, and they're taking on cases that really matter. So we're seeing firms really take steps that are addressing both their recruits and their clients. And I would just stress to firms to get ahead of this rather than wait for the clients to push, because GCs are smarter these days than they ever were before. And they have amazing departments with very sophisticated people involved in business functions. And they also have great people in operations. And they're going to be asking these questions more and more. And I think the firms really need to make sure that they're doing the right things before they're asked.
Thanks so much, Deborah. And I see we're up on the 2 o'clock hour. I think the panel is happy to stay around for a few more minutes. We welcome questions and comments. If any of the panelists would like to make closing remarks, please do. Well, thank you to Joy, Deborah, Taurus, and David. I greatly enjoyed this dialogue, learned a great deal. And I hope the audience found it as insightful as I did. Thank you so much.
Thanks, DB.
What we're doing.
Thanks, everyone.